In exciting news, we are now entering the next phase of Australia's interest rate cycle. Doesn't seem like it because there has been no interest rate cuts, but the RBA have now changed tune. To actually cut interest rates, the RBA is going to go through a process, and we have entered the second phase of that process. In this episode, we're going to go through how the RBA are going to be cutting interest rates here in Australia, whether it's going to be in 2024 or 2025, and what benchmarks and key markers are we looking for before they go and actually act. We're going to go through Australia's growth story in detail, our employment reports, our inflation data, and run through broadly how the Australian economy is performing in the eyes of the RBA. Finally, we're going to do a comparison between Australia and the United States, who are on a tear at the moment and expecting a different outcome with interest rates and economic growth to Australia at the moment. Curtis, how are you?
Yeah, going well. Like you say, the tides are shifting a little bit, so it's good to unpack that in a bit more detail because these things move a little slowly. I would say it's like...
it's a ship.
Yeah, a ship or like a big jumbo jet or something, like a big A380. Like these things don't turn quickly. Like the captain discusses it with the other people flying the plane first, then they announce they're going to turn it. Then they start turning. It's not like your little sports car that you just change direction whenever you want. Like these are big ships, big airplanes. True, they turn slowly, but you can kind of read the winds and see, if a turn is upcoming, which is probably where we're at now.
Yeah, exactly. So let's run through the steps that we are going through from a period of increasing interest rates, which we've been in for the last couple of years, to cutting interest rates. So I've kind of broken this down into a few steps. And the first step was, hey, we're going to stop increasing interest rates, but we're going to be out there being like, we expect to increase interest rates further. That was a message in November, in December, in January, a little bit softer. That's been the message over the last 3 or 4 months. But now that we sit here in March, after the March RBA meeting, that message is now moved into phase 2. We are now in the phase where the RBA have dropped their explicit tightening bias, which is, by that we mean the communication that we expect to increase interest rates. They've dropped that. They now have, we can't rule anything in or out. And they changed the increase to anything, which could be an increase or decrease. So we are now officially in a neutral bias setting. So the RBA are not communicating to the market, we expect to increase interest rates, we're not expecting to cut interest rates. We kind of don't know. That's kind of the message that they're coming out with, the neutral setting. That is phase 2 of this sort of pathway to cutting interest rates. And we are here now. Do you agree with me? Is that where you see the RBA at the moment?
Yes. And I think it's probably useful to unpack. There's 2 ways the RBA can impact the economy and the markets for rates, really. Like one is actually changing rates, but the other is how they communicate and what their expectations are, how they talk about it.
Yes.
And often the way they talk about it, they can use that as a tool rather than actually having to change rates. And what we've seen is rates have been on hold now since November. But what we're picking up on is there's been a change in the communication, a change in what they're speaking about. And that is a flag for potentially changing the actual interest rate. And they use this on the way up and the way down, if that makes sense. If they, like I would say over the last few months, they've been noticing that the market has been expecting rate cuts. People are talking about rate cuts. Rates are very tight. They want to keep the pressure on getting inflation down. So they can do that by raising rates, which they did in November. But in the subsequent meetings where they've left rates on hold, they've left them on hold, but communicated that they're very worried about inflation. They're monitoring. They can't rule out further rate rises. These types of things to basically keep the pressure on without actually changing rates. But when the communication shifts, which is what we've seen at the last RBA meeting, that is a bit of a leading indicator that the actual changes to the rates are coming down the line.
Exactly. So unpacking that a little bit, before they cut interest rates, they need to stop saying that they're going to increase interest rates, and then they need to start saying that we don't plan on increasing or decreasing interest rates. And then there's a third step that is phase 3, where we expect softening in interest rates to be coming down the line. They will indicate an easing bias without actually doing it, most likely first.
Yep.
And then there's the step 4, which is what everyone's waiting for. When are you going to cut rates? That is the next step. So that's step 4. We have passed the first check mark. We're onto the second check mark, where they're not saying they're going to increase rates anymore. They're saying, hey, we don't know what we're going to do. We're going to move to check mark 3 at some point later this year, where we expect to cut interest rates, and then the actual delivery of cut rates. So that's the 4-step sort of process, and the process is largely just communication. They're not actually doing anything, but it's what they're saying. That's the key message. And that is what has changed. There's a second bit too in their messaging that came out. This one's a little bit in the weeds, and I don't have it on the top of my head, but they talked about inflation coming down with increased momentum. So they basically, the inflation report cards coming out recently have been pretty good, very good. I haven't seen today's, there's a data release that's just come out, but I haven't seen that yet. So broadly, inflation news has been positive, and it's been coming in positive, a bit stronger than they expected to the last quarter of last year. Yeah, a bit lower than expected. So they've talked about the momentum of the inflation trajectory has been better than expected a little bit, which is accompanied with their removal of their tightening bias. That was part of the justification. Bringing inflation down is our number one priority, but it's coming down a little bit quicker than we expected, and there's a bit of momentum in that decline, so we don't need to say that we're going to be increasing interest rates when this is the data that we're operating with today.
Yeah, basically they can take a little bit of that pressure off. And I think that, we're talking about all these steps before rates get cut.
Yep.
I think in reality, in order for the RBA or really any central bank to kind of skip those steps, like that occurs in, more emergency situations.
Yes.
Something like the GFC or something that necessitates skipping those steps. So that's why we're watching this so closely, because unless there's some kind of emergency or something really, really bad happens economically, it is going to follow this trajectory where these communication milestones will be hit before rates actually get cut.
Yeah, you're a plane guy. So we remain a jumbo jet, and then if it becomes really, really bad, we turn into one of those fighter pilot ones that you see in Top Gun. That in
like
quickly.
In an emergency, like things can actually move very, very fast if they had to.
Yeah.
But the RBA policymakers don't like moving things quickly. They like moving things extremely slowly with like a much higher level of certainty, a much higher level of communication to the markets. So things aren't unexpected. That's the way they like to do things. It's a little boring. People probably don't like it because it means rate cut. We talk about rate cuts for months and months and months before anything actually happens. But that's the way they like to do things, and it should play out unless there's some kind of emergency.
This is an interesting side note. As the top level policymakers, so the people who have the power to pull the strings, the RBA governor, the APRA chief, the Treasury Secretary Kennedy, the Treasurer, the people who set the foundations and policy settings that Australians live by, they are a little bit like anaesthetists here. Most of the time, they're just sitting there, not doing very much, and you're like, wow, why am I paying thousands of dollars to sit here and be play on their phone? That's probably doing them a little bit of disservice, but most of the time, they're actually not doing that much in terms of action. They're talking at the moment, like me and you are talking right now. We're talking. That's what they're doing, right? Obviously, they're far more important. What they say is far more important, but not doing all that much. But then, when you're the pilot of a plane being like, oh crap, we're about to go into a thunderstorm here. That thunderstorm is the Australian economy and the livelihoods of 26 million Australians. Oh, yikes. We got to make decisions quickly and move. And the reason why I talk about this is inside that Treasury building, when you talk to some of these top-level economists who have been there, and the stories they share, it's always about the time, they're all nerds like us that live and breathe this stuff, they always talk about the time that they were holding the steering wheel and when chaos was there. The ABS chief, who was Dr. Gruen, he loves the story. He tells everyone he knows at every opportunity in Macro Group when we were there about how he was there when they cut interest rates 1 full percentage point in one meeting, and the decision turned on a dime inside hours the night before, where everyone was expecting 0.25, 0.5, and that night he was there being like, and a bunch of the board members are like, holy moly, what's happening in the United States here? We need to do more, a lot more. So, it is a tanker ship that we are in at the moment, where communication is what they're using. But we're nimble enough to be able to move at pace when required. And we saw that during COVID, the last big time that happened.
Yeah. So, but I think in current circumstances, we're not expecting the need for any of that nimble movement. So again, that's why we're tracking the relatively subtle changes in communication quite closely, because we expect it will follow the kind of standard drawn out process that we see play out over months. And like you say, the RBA have removed that tightening bias, which is the first step along the road to cutting rates.
Yeah, exactly. This week, the AFR asked me, being like, one of the journalists asked me, what do you think in terms of market level sentiment from the current rate communication that's come out? So has the market adjusted to this? No, I don't think the market has adjusted in any way to the RBA removing their tightening bias. But there is some level of cautiousness that remains out there from people operating in the market day to day that are sitting on the sidelines with active pre-approvals, but not actively hunting. They're not fear of missing out sort of phase. They're not out there being like, I need to participate, I need to buy, which is what I expect to come when these rate cuts do kick in. That FOMO, that Sydney FOMO of the Sydney side are out there being like, hey, I want to do something. I think right now there's cautiousness out there, and the home buyer sentiment out there is not strong because interest rates are really high. The economy is not doing great relative to average. It's not high, but it's leading to a little bit of cautiousness by the buyer at the moment in the marketplace. And that cautiousness will likely go away when interest rates are cut. And you might see those sitting on the sidelines jump in with steam, I guess. And the trigger point that they need is actually a cut in rates, because one cut in rates may mean 2 cut in rates, may mean 3 cut in rates. And if your CBA means 6 cuts in rates, that's what they're saying. So that is playing out at market level, on the ground, housing market conditions. You're seeing some of the idle period that we're in with interest rates. You're seeing some of that in the market as well.
Yeah, I think that's a little bit of a reflection of the way this plays out, which like realistically over the next few months, I probably expect every time the RBA meet, the talk is going to be, will they cut rates? The answer is going to be no. Yes. But the talk is, are rates going to be cut? So that idea is in people's minds, in people's faces, but there's not going to be any action on it. And we will live in this little holding pattern for, potentially a couple of months, potentially several months.
Yep.
And I think, there is a large group of people who are going, okay, well, every 6 weeks now I hear about interest rates being cut and nothing ever happens. So like I'm waiting to see some actual action. And like you see, when rates actually get cut, that's when things really kick off. Because then instead of this seemingly endless cycle of people talking about rate cuts but nothing ever happening, going round and round and round, you break that and you're actually getting some movement. And then it's one rate cut. Then it's like, our rate's going to get cut again. And in the space of 12 weeks, 18 weeks, you might have a couple of successive rate cuts. And that's when things on the ground probably really, really move.
That's true. Can I ask you a question? I think this is really important in terms of, it's probably an early discussion, so it's something that we'll probably circle back to later on. What do you think the neutral interest rate is that doesn't support economic growth but doesn't slow down the economy either today? No one has any real idea, so I'm just going to work offline. You probably have a really good educated guess.
I reckon maybe cash rate of 3.5%.
3.5%. Okay. Ooh.
Yeah, which is probably maybe a little higher than some expectations, but I reckon about 3. I reckon it is slightly higher than people expect, so maybe about 3.5.
3.5%. Okay, so that is actually theoretically what the RBA suggests. They suggest 2.5% is the midpoint of that 2 to 3% band that they have generally targeted, plus productivity growth, which is, if we're all doing things a little bit better, then the real interest rate should be 3.5%. So that's something that they briefly mentioned on their first interest rate increase when they were gently communicating to Australians, being like, hey, we're going to have to increase interest rates by a lot. It's not going to be 50 basis points or 100 basis points. We don't want to scare you and say we're going to do that. But they did mention that 3.5% figure.
Yeah.
Without saying it a little bit implicitly. Dr. Lowe did talk about it in a press conference there. So 3.5%. Okay. Well, that has implications because that, in my mind, would mean if they cut rates, they're probably only cutting rates a few times. I think the first phase of, so this is talking about the RBA period and cycle. We talked about the steps that they'll go through. Step 5 is once they start cutting rates, how many times will you cut rates? I think they will cut rates close-ish to neutral within a few months.
I think, if by my assumption of 3.5%, we're not looking at that many cuts. We're saying, they're going to cut rates 3 times, 4 times. So,
Can I test you a little bit on that?
Yeah.
So 3.5%. The Australian economy, we're going to talk about growth anyway. Australian economy is growing at 1% at the moment. Over the last 6 months, forget about what the data says. The last 6 months, we have grown at 1% and slowing. It's fallen in the latest data releases. So 1%. We're growing well below trend, less than half trend growth. Population growth is very, very high as well, at 2.5%. Interest rates are only a little bit past neutral. So you're saying that monetary policy isn't really the main cause of this big slowdown? Is that? Am I taking it too far? Is this like a debate trick, being like cornering you into a position? I don't mean to do that. I mean, does 3.5% seem realistic of neutral when, hey, look, this is the economic data and we're only, less than a percentage point in terms of rates above it. Do you get what I mean?
Yes, I get what you mean.
And the reason why I say that is CBA are saying that the neutral interest rate, they don't know either. They're saying 2.5 to 3. The RBA's probably that 3.5.
I think the difference between maybe what I'm saying and what CBA is saying, I don't actually think it's a data thing. I think it's more what the RBA will see their role as thing. So my view is that inflation is likely to be more entrenched at higher levels for the next 3, 4, 5 years. I just don't think it's going to be super low. And I think the RBA are going to say, that's our job. If economic growth sucks, go talk to Jim Chalmers. Obviously that's a very strong way of saying it, but I think behind closed doors, Michelle Bullock is like, hey, Reserve Bank, that's what's written above here. What's inflation? Between 2 and 3? Get out. If you want higher economic growth, come up with something. You're the elected treasurer, you run the economy, not me. I do interest rates. I think that might be the way the RBA view things over the next 2-3 years.
You actually provided the explanation there.
I think eventually you get to a point where if economic growth is so low for so long, the RBA will step in and try and use interest rates to balance that out. But I think off the back of a very high inflation period and what they've been through over the last 2 years, I think it's highly likely the RBA will not focus on bad economic growth numbers unless they're really bad. They will push that responsibility to the treasurer. And that's where I think if they've got inflation sitting in band, they're not going to be mucking around, is my guess, in the short term. Over, say, a 5-year period.
Makes sense, yeah. Actually.
If the Australian economy continues to perform really badly, which to be honest, really badly is probably a bit extreme, softly. And I think pre-COVID, this was kind of the scenario where productivity growth was low. We were ticking along, but we're not really shooting the lights out. As an economy, we're not really making any great strides forward. We've got interest rates probably a little bit below neutral settings just in order to hit our stock standard economic growth numbers.
Yeah, below 0.
Yeah.
Close to 0,
really ever since post-GFC, right? So we could well be in a scenario where we're back in that world. I don't know if anything's changed on the product. We'll see if things have changed fundamentally that we can actually hit those growth numbers that we're trying to hit with rates at a neutral setting. I think, maybe 5-6 years that will play out and rates might need to sit below the neutral setting. But I think in the next couple of years, I can't I can't see the RBA taking on a wider mandate. And this is now we're just totally in the commentary space, but this is something that I feel
it's always
like
what we do.
The current commentary on the RBA is a little off, that people seem to think that, yes, unemployment's very important, economic growth, but they seem to think that the RBA is really, really into its wider mandate. And I actually think the RBA is very, very scared of its wider mandate. And it is an inflation targeting regime, and it has a wider mandate that it can call on, but at its core, it's an inflation targeting operation. Yep. And I think they'll be very reluctant to move outside that space.
Yep, that's true. I think you touched on it by putting the focus on inflation there as to what the neutral rate is, and suggesting that inflation is going to remain higher than our pre-COVID time. And that's entirely possible. Well, the one great uncertainty here is how long does it take for inflation and all the money that's been thrown into the system? We've got to remember that inflation comes from throwing money into an economic system. That's like it's a money supply problem. And we threw a lot of it inside a very short period of time at the same time as stopping production. So how much of that increase that we threw in at that time that led to inflation, how does it pulse out of the Australian economy? Does it lead to a structural uplift? And the 8% figure that we got to was just wow, you've put way too much. You've just given a kid too much sugar, way too much sugar. Yeah. But has the kid gone fat? From that sugar rush that you've given them. And now are we just more bloated as a result? Permanently in Australia, we bloated with a different structural economy here from that stimulus that we gave to the economy. And does it mean we're a bit bigger from an inflation perspective? If that's a good analogy, that's kind of how I'm imagining it. Or do we just revert back to, it was just a sugar rush. You ran around a little bit and you're back to normal. So that's a little bit of the picture that we don't know. That makes sense.
Yeah. I think there's two separate questions, really. So one is what's the neutral cash rate for inflation? And then what's the neutral cash rate for economic growth? They might be temporarily.
I think they're linked, though.
They are linked, but temporarily over the next few years, they might be two slightly different numbers in the sense that I think inflation is a little more entrenched and is likely to remain so for structural reasons over the next 2-3 years, which means the neutral rate for inflation could be 3.5 if my total dartboard guess is correct, and the neutral cash rate for economic growth might be 2.5 or something. You might have a bit of a spread there. And I think in the circumstance where you do have that spread, I can't see the RBA leaning towards protecting economic growth.
Yeah, unless inflation's below band. Yep.
Yeah, that's the way I kind of see it. They're going to basically, like I say, well, you need to talk to Jim Chalmers. We do monetary policy. He does fiscal policy. That's largely not our problem. Too bad, so sad kind of thing.
Yeah. That's very potential sort of scenario with it. I think the CBA economists are more right, but I don't really know why. 3.5% just seems really, really high. And the level of economic slowdown and the level of how our households are responding. We talked about that in one of our previous episodes where they are struggling, and it's being picked up in the data that their spending is being cut so much. I don't think dropping interest rates 75 basis points gets them spending enough for the Australian economy to grow at 2.5% to keep everything in tick. And I think we do need to grow at 2.5% to keep inflation.
I agree with that. Okay, but then let's reverse the question. If you're in a circumstance where, say, the cash rate's 3.5 and you've got inflation in band, but economic growth is really, really slow, what are the policy questions being asked, around the table? Are we going to Michelle Bullock being hey, can you cut rates to get the economy up and running? And is she going yes, that's something I'm willing to contemplate? Or is she going, we're still in band, on inflation, I'm not moving until, unless I think inflation's going down the bottom side of the band. So if there's an economic growth problem, someone's got to solve it, but it's not me.
It's true. That's true. I think that's just really, really hard for our governments to do on whole. I think it's hard to sit there with maybe the world has changed, but I think it's very hard to sit there with 3.5% interest rates if our economy is growing too slowly. Because if our economy is growing significantly too slowly, let's just say it's a 1% thing, it means our employment growth is too weak and people are being added to the unemployment line. And if we're growing our population at the same pace as we are today or anywhere near that, it means that the jobs market is just not doing what it needs to do. It is not giving people jobs because our economy is not growing fast enough, and hence businesses are not hiring quickly enough. And I think it's just a very strange government that sits there being like, cool, you keep interest rates at 3.5% while you have that. It also suggests to me that the neutral interest rate, if those are the settings, much like we have today, just change the cash rate to 3.5% and bring inflation down to 2.5%. If you change those metrics, be like, that is odd. The metrics are odd. Be like, well, everyone's going to ask the question, being like, why do you have interest rates 3.5% when you can take 100,000 people off the unemployment line if you brought it to 2.5%? And
but I think Michelle Bullock will be saying inflation is. If I drop interest rates, inflation's going above 3. I'm not doing that.
Yeah, I don't think she'll believe that though, unless there's a reason for inflation to be high. Because where is the inflation coming from?
Yeah, that's true. Like, to be honest, the way I see it actually playing out is, I think maybe that 3.5 is right. I think it sits there for, a year, a couple of years. I think economic growth is really, really slow. I think on the fiscal policy side of things, there's next to no action, because that's, maybe I'm a little cynical because I've worked in that space, but I just kind of assume nothing will get done, nothing will change. And then over the space of 2 or 3, maybe 1, 2 or 3 years, economic growth will be really, really slow. Like you say, unemployment will creep up and up and up. I don't think it'll be drastic. It'll take a bit of time. And eventually that'll result in inflation falling out the bottom end of the band. And that's where you're going to get rate cuts. I think but I don't think the RBA would be preemptively taking the lead on that policy decision. I think that will be essentially the RBA acting on a lack of government response or ability to impact economic growth. And that eventually resulting in inflation falling out the low end.
Yep. So we're going to have high inflation prints, basically, ongoing. That makes sense? The recent inflation prints already put us back in band, and you get them for the next
and they'll be ongoing. And eventually, the lack of economic performance will result in inflation going down the low end of the band, and that's when we'll get further cuts. That's my guess. And I think that might play out over an extended period of time rather than a short space of time.
Is that COVID policy settings taking longer to feed out of the system? Because pre-COVID, we couldn't even get inflation anywhere near the bottom of the band.
Yeah, I think so. But
something's changed here.
Yes, I think COVID, but I think it's not just domestic as well. It's international. There's higher inflation around the world. I just don't think it's going to flush out of the world economy in a short space of time. But I can see economic growth being soft, unless something, because it was soft pre-COVID as well. Unless something's fundamentally changed on productivity, which maybe it has, but unless something's fundamentally changed, I can see.
We've actually been here before a little bit.
Yeah.
I recall when interest rates were actually 1.5 or 2.5%, I was sitting there being you need to cut rates. And the reason why you need to cut rates is because unemployment's at 5.5%. While America, they start with a 3. This is ridiculous. Australia, what are you doing? That's what I genuinely thought. Be Australia, what are you doing? We're protecting inflation in housing markets at the expense of jobs, and jobs should always be, in my opinion, the government's number one priority. Get Australia fully employed. That is a signal of excellent government, in my opinion. It's the scorecard. Obviously, there is no performance benchmark like this. The votes that is the performance benchmark, but in terms of helping people, actually making people's lives better and the most vulnerable people's lives better, the best thing you could do is not cut rents or get them in jobs. That's what they need. They could have harder lives. But really, if you can get 100,000 people off the unemployment line, getting a few $100s a week and getting them into jobs, their livelihoods are better. And back then, Philip Lowe was in charge, and he was very reluctant to cut interest rates. This was in 2018.
Yeah.
Right? So the 2018 experience was when our unemployment was sitting with 5 and the US were doing really, really well. And it just seemed like wait, should we cut rates? Like,
Yeah.
The downside to that was they were sitting there being like, we don't really want to do that because it could lead to inflation or it could lead to...
which to me makes perfect sense. Like if I'm the RBA governor, like...
But then they did cut rates. They gave up on that. They're like
eventually you have to, because like the inflation targeting and the lack of economic performance will eventually align themselves. Like I think that's kind of the way the system's built. But I can totally understand the reluctance, and I don't see how anyone sitting in the RBA governor's chair would not have that reluctance. Like it's not your job.
Full employment is their job. They actually have the change in the RBA's job has now elevated it to the number one position. They now have a cross mandate, a dual mandate, a very clear dual mandate.
I know.
Full employment and stable inflation.
I don't think Michelle Bullock believes that. But yeah, I like that it has changed, but I think like
But what's full employment? You can change that definition.
Yeah,
around.
and like I think more and more we look to the RBA governor to be like the one running our economy. Yeah, and I think it's not
for sure.
That's not
Treasurer does that too.
Yeah, of course. Why wouldn't you? It's like a good way to just shift responsibility. Like if I was the treasurer, I'd do that as well. But like, that's not my problem. Talk to her. But like that's not her job. Like you can try and make it her job, but it's not her job. The whole idea of the central bank and inflation targeting theory, not to drag this down into the weeds, is like that is a separate responsibility. Like, and I can just see her being like, if I get
inflation scarring, I'm going to call it that. They're inflation scarred. They're scarred from this recent experience.
But
like,
even from
we don't want high inflation again.
Even from like a cynical
lost his job.
Even from a cynical like human perspective, if you're Michelle Bullock, right, and you're like, my job is now full employment and inflation, like
balancing the two. Yeah.
That is the worst job in the world. Like there is no success, right? Like nothing she does is going to be good enough ever. Like it's just you're going to get your backside kicked. Like no matter what happens. I think she wants to be able to stand there and be like, I've got inflation back at between 2% and 3%. Like the wheels haven't fallen off. Like I am doing a good job. Like I have succeeded. You can argue about how, like whether I'm the greatest ever or whether I'm doing okay, but like I am doing a good job. I am ticking my performance benchmarks. Like, and that's how I
don't think she can say that though. She's failed if we don't have full employment. But to be honest, I think full employment isn't defined as 3. It's defined as 4.5 or something. They've changed the benchmarks.
Yeah, but I guess what I'm saying is I can't imagine she's going to be out there being like, oh no, I'll take this cross to bear. Like I want it. I want full employment to be my problem. I want inflation targeting to be my problem. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, I think from her perspective, it's just like, well, you're just going to be chasing your tail. Meanwhile, Jim Chalmers or whoever the treasurer is at the time is like, well, like, what is their responsibility then? If they're like, what, GDP? Like, is that the last variable that's left?
Yeah,
like,
is that
the only thing they're responsible for? Like, don't have to worry about interest rates. Full employment's not my problem. Like, I just have to like read out a GDP number.
They talk about that actually. Yeah.
So
it's one of the great things. So right now the AFR is going through the business roundtable and doing their banking summit, and Matt Comyn went completely off script. He kind of like us, just going off script, talking about whatever we want, and he just talked about. He got asked the question, be like, "How would you make Australia grow?" And he's like, before he answered, he gave the caveat of like, I know I'm Combank CEO and my corporate affairs team, I'm sorry because I know I can't say this. And he just went off the cuff and said, I would cut income tax. It'd cost me 30 billion. I would increase the GST. This is how I'd do it. And I'd make up another 30 billion through efficiencies. And he gave like a detailed budget breakdown. Be like, this is how you grow. This is how you get back to our growth levels that we need to do. So maybe this would create some sort of momentum for governments to create some change to promote growth.
Yes, and that's, I think, the way it should play out, if that makes sense. Like, that's how it should play out. Like, it's not Michelle Bullock's job to promote growth.
Yeah. Like, to be honest, it's a fairly healthy economy. It's a little bit like this signals to the US, actually. So I think you're right about the US specifically. Like, I can put those frameworks back to the US. The US had interest rates at 0 for a long period of time and had quantitative easing for a decade. Threw money at the problem, right? And they couldn't get inflation up. They couldn't even get inflation anywhere near where they needed to get it. Even with this quantitative easing program, printing money, throwing it into the system, it just led to asset inflation. They couldn't get growth to where it needed to be. Now, they're flying.
Yeah.
Their household sector is increasing their living standards effectively. We're moving backwards at 7%, or 7 to 10% over this like period over the last 3 or 4 years. They're increased by 3 or 4%. Not a huge increase, but an increase from already the most developed and richest economy in the world, and they're still growing and increasing, and the American households are feeling it because they're the ones having real income growth. Their growth performance is really good. Their unemployment figures going backwards again, and trend-wise as well. Their unemployment rates, again, below 4%, and will probably stay there.
Yeah.
The inflation problem, by and large, they have a 2% target, by and large, gone. They are sitting in whatever they've done is absolute Goldilocks. They have a productivity boom driving their performance. I don't know whether that's being the home of AI or whatnot, but it is clearly really, really good data. So when you look at, nonetheless, their central bank is saying we need to cut rates. Obviously, they're at 5.25. So they're sitting there being like, okay, interest rates are really, really high. We went from 0 and quantitative easing to 5.25. We've done our job here and inflation's back down. So let's start cutting rates. At some point, they've done the talking about we're going to cut rates. So their neutral setting sounds about right. That makes sense because their employment market is really good and their GDP growth is really good. So they can sit there without they've got full employment and inflation's coming back down. In Australia, in the absence of new information, the economy, we are benchmarking at the moment to really average sort of levels, poor levels. We're accepting 1% growth. We're accepting GDP recessions for a full year.
Per capita recessions.
These aren't acceptable benchmarks. We're accepting it because we're in transition. Once inflation goes away, we're at 3.3% or whatever it is, once inflation's at 2.9 or 2.8, why are we going to accept a benchmark of mediocrity? Because that is where we're at. We are falling backwards per person. Our incomes are falling. Our employment market is weakening as a result of GDP growth, and it's a lag indicator, the longer GDP growth. This is mediocrity, if that makes sense. The reason why we're taking on mediocrity is because inflation's too high. But once the inflation problem's gone, why is the central bank going to be there? We accept mediocrity for Australia. That seems a bit harsh.
I don't know that we're accepting mediocrity because inflation's too high, though. That's where I probably differ. When I hear the American story, my thought isn't wow, Jerome Powell must have done such a better job than Michelle Bullock to get that outcome. I'm thinking what are the fiscal policy settings, the tax settings, all the other non-interest rate settings in America that are getting them productivity growth, economic activity. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it is that the Federal Reserve has managed things in a more delicate, light-handed, intricate way than the RBA have, and that's produced a better outcome. But my instinct is that they are really doing better on a whole bunch of other policy settings.
I agree with that, but it doesn't really matter. Does the detail?
But that's the question. To who? To Jim Chalmers or to Michelle Bullock?
To Australians. They don't matter either.
But Michelle, Jim Chalmers is the one that's elected, if that makes sense. Michelle Bullock's the one that's given a job to do, if that makes sense.
By and large, they represent Australians. Australian outcomes are mediocrity. These people are just people in charge. But the mediocrity outcomes impact our lives, and they are representatives of our lives. So why would the people in charge accept mediocrity here when performance levels internationally are so good? And with that in mind, why would you set interest rates really high? To be honest, don't you just keep cutting until you get into... Don't you do something about... Basically, don't you go and do something? If that makes sense?
Maybe.
Doesn't it force action when GDP... eventually, that should force action. If you continually make people go backwards, if we have the same story through 2023, a 7% fall, let's do it again.
Yeah.
That only occurs from high inflation, but take the inflation problem away. Won't we start being let's lift our ambition?
Yes, but I think that is a question for the Australian voters and the government they elect.
Yep,
I think that's to me, that's how I think of that is if the ambition levels of the Australian voters have increased and we're not prepared to accept mediocrity, then the pressure will be on not Michelle Bullock. The pressure should be on Jim Chalmers and Anthony Albanese to deliver those results. And if they don't deliver results, then they get turfed out and someone else gets put in and has a crack at it. But I don't think it's the RBA governor's job to drive that ambition. I think that's the PM and the treasurer to bring the country forward. That's what you're talking about.
I think the difference is you're talking about the handbrake of inflation being there. That makes sense. I'm saying that the inflation of handbrake.
Even if it's not even just let's just say it's in band. Forget high inflation. Because I think that in a relatively short space of time, that's going to be out of the picture anyway, right? So then the question is there will be some neutral cash rate setting where inflation is in band. And then the question is, does that produce the economic performance that we want? And the answer to that question could well be no. We're still undershooting our economic performance targets. We're not growing as fast as our competitors, like other advanced economies. So
I don't understand how the RBA statement of monetary policy in this circumstance wouldn't suggest inflation continually falling, because that would be what their CGI models would all come up with.
Eventually, it'll fall, yeah. But I think
it'll be within the 18-month window. That's why they've got inflation coming back down.
But if inflation falls out of band, then I think they 100% will cut. But I think their mindset will be inflation targeting, not being we are undershooting, we are underperforming the OECD countries. We're less ambitious than other countries are getting better economic results than us. That's not acceptable. Therefore, I'm going to throw some monetary stimulus to try and move things along. I think they're going to
adjust the
inflation target.
I think that's true, but that might be a change. I think we need to be growing. This is the thing. We need to be growing at 2 to 3% to get inflation at 2 to 3%. Otherwise, we're not going to get the inflation. That inflation problem goes away.
Yeah.
The reason why we're coming back down from 8 to 3 is because we've stopped growing. We've gone backwards.
Yeah.
If we continue to keep having a GDP per capita recession or GDP so slow, how on earth are we going to get inflation at 2 to 3? The handbrake's gone. That handbrake is a function of us, and they've been at pains over the last year or two of the Australian economy being in overheat mode. We're not in overheat mode anymore. Yeah. So when when the temperature's too low, being the inflation might be in band now, but forward looking, being inflation's going to come down. But maybe there's a reason for that being changed. And you've touched on those reasons. You've touched on inflation being a bit different. You've touched on globalization.
I think it'll just take longer. I think ultimately, these two things you have to hit your equilibrium, right? You can't have inflation entrenched at 2.5% and economic growth at 0 for a decade. It just doesn't that dichotomy. That doesn't work. It's been a long time since I've done the math models on this, but I assume if you run that out for 10 years, it just doesn't work. It's not possible. But
I think if you run it for 6 months, it's not possible.
Yeah, that's where I differ. I think for 6 months
from here.
I think for maybe I think for 2 years.
Where's the inflation coming from? So it's shocks then. It's not domestic factors. We're not growing. Employment's moving backwards. 0% growth. Employment's moving backwards. So where is the inflation coming from? How are prices going up? Must be supply related factors.
Yeah. Which I think could be a bit of a hangover from COVID and just inflation around the world.
These are structural changes.
Which I think might take an extended period of time to flush through. Which might mean you're in a period of a couple of. You might mean you're in a period in a couple of years where the cash rate sits at 3.5, even though growth is below target, every year. And then I think it will only be, eventually it'll catch up with itself and inflation will fall as a result of consistent low growth, because eventually it has to. Kind of agree with that. But I think
in the short term,
that could well be the situation. And from a decision-making perspective.
So you think we'll still have slow growth as well? So you think inflation will be a little bit high, but we'll still have slow growth through this period?
Yes.
I do believe the growth story. I don't know where that's coming from.
Yeah. I think that. And then I just think from a decision-making perspective, the RBA aren't going to go out of their way to bail us out of that problem, if that makes sense.
I agree. That's entirely possible. This is a coherent narrative you put out. I tested it, for the listeners here. The reason why we got into this debate and the questions that I keep throwing back at you was to test your view and why and unpack it a little bit more. So, the inflation story remaining for a bit longer, the structural change in inflation, the slowing of the Australian economy, and putting some pressure on, federal governments to throw in some action to help create a change here, and the slower revert back to interest rates. These all impacts markets significantly. It impacts borrowing capacities, it impacts lending, it impacts jobs. It impacts all of the key macro variables that go into Australian property. So it's a really, really interesting thought exercise. So thank you for going through all that.
I hope I'm wrong, because it's a bit of a sad story in the sense that it would mean we're a little bit back to the pre-COVID situation where our economic performance is a little underwhelming and soft, and we're just kind of back in that world, and we've got slightly lower interest rates as a result. If we
That's a great result, in my opinion.
But if we could get economic growth, if we could get like economic growth between 2 and 3% while the cash rate's at 3.5%, then like
that's great. That's America.
That's awesome. Yeah, like that would be by far a better result. Is that we've got economic growth coming out of our ears, and there's no need to cut rates to promote it.
This world that you're promoting, this is what I was really testing through this episode. It's very different to the 2010s. For 2 decades, we've barely had inflation. We've barely been able to get inflation. We haven't, the entire developed world hasn't been able to get inflation.
It would be the same.
You're saying inflation is going to be too high.
Yeah, but I think you end up in that world again, where inflation might be too high for the next like 1 to 2 years as a bit of a hangover, and then you're back in this world of relatively slow economic growth, which results in relatively low inflation and
then back to 0% interest rates over time.
Yeah, over time, and then maybe eventually someone will have a crack at some fiscal policy or some actual real reform at some point in like 20 years in the future.
Fingers crossed.
But like, I hope that doesn't happen, because for whatever reason, if we can get really, really good economic growth, like that's by far the most exciting, successful way through it.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. There you have it. One of the best economic minds that I know. I'm going to call it that Australia has.
Wow, okay.
What a great compliment to Kat. Providing a perspective on what our economy looks like, not just today, but over coming years, a comparison between Australia and the United States, and a full in-depth discussion about how our inflation story looks in the years ahead and how it circles back to Australian property. Join us for our next episode, dropping soon.